Today we shall discuss the Mother of God in art. Okay, obviously in Paleo-Christian art, and then maybe we'll move slightly into the medieval period, just because of some themes which are coming from the Paleo-Christian period all the way till the medieval. Now, this topic, this lecture is quite long, so I will be dividing the video in various parts, even not to make it too difficult for the upload and also for you to watch it. Anyway, so the Mother of God, Mary. Nowadays, it is practically impossible to go into any church or into any place of cult, any place of worship, where you don't see an image of Mary. Not even if you go into these modern churches, which look more like garages than churches, you always will find somewhere some kind of image of Mary. But how was Mary depicted at the very beginning? I mean, when in this era that we are discussing, how was Mary presented in art, and what did the artists, or rather the people who commissioned the artists to make images of Mary, what was the teaching that they wanted to pass through the image of Mary? That is what we shall be trying to discuss and present in these lectures now. So the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that in the first 4 centuries, that is from the year 0, let's say, till the year about 300, Mary's figure appears in Christian art always in relation to the figure of Christ. Therefore, for the first 300 years, we never find images of Mary on her own. Okay, there is always some kind of link between her and her son. And this corresponds to the development of Christian thought about her. Now, as we said, art goes hand in hand with what is going on in this case, the Christian world. Okay, we did say that many times. To understand and to appreciate fully what an image contains, we have to go and see what the texts say about these particular images. And we also said that sometimes to get a fuller picture of what the texts are saying, we have to consult the art coming from that period. Now, Christian dogma enters into this picture as well. We cannot expect to find particular image, let's say, exhibitions rather in sacred imagery, if there is not a contemporary kind of movement related to doctrine, okay, to dogma. And the case of Mary is one of the best examples that we can get. Okay, Mary was originally the subject of reflection only in relation to her son when we speak about Christian doctrine or Christian dogma, Christian teaching. And this is what we see in art as well. Okay, first we see Mary always in relation to Christ. It was only after the mid-4th century that Mary became an independent subject of theological reflection. So after the mid-4th century, I was right. After the mid-4th century, Mary starts being treated as a subject on her own in writings, dogma, and also in art. The correspondence between the development of Mary as a subject in theological deliberation and Mary as a subject in Christian art is yet another very clear indication of the similarity in the process of these two disciplines, as we said in the very first lecture, proving that thought and craft developed hand in hand within the context of early Christianity. The first images of Mary, therefore, are to be understood in the light of the living faith of the community which produced them. We cannot avoid remembering also that this community had Judeo-Christian origins. Okay, Christianity has Jewish roots, and that is something which we can never avoid. Okay, you can never deny this fact, and therefore, in the way that Christians think, and also in the way that Christians represent art, in some way there is some kind of relation with how the Jews before used to think rather than represent, because Jews never represented human images, human figures. But the thought beneath all this, I think the foundational level between Christians and Jews is very, very similar, and we can never put this thing aside. So the community had, as you are saying, Judeo-Christian origins, which were felt in the first community of Rome. Okay, so therefore, even the Christians in Rome had kind of these Judeo-Christian ideas. Okay, obviously I cannot get into the subject here, But if you, for example, would go and read the letter of Clement to the Corinthians, which was written around the year 89, you will see that even though this thing is written in Rome, it is written in Greek, it has many, many Judeo-Christian ideas. Okay, so as you can see, in Christianity, that was the first idea that spread all over the place where there were new Christians. So these Judeo-Christian foundations were felt in Rome, and therefore this kind of idea of representing Mary in art was inspired from biblical texts and also from the texts coming from the fathers. Okay, the first images of Mary are strictly related to the Bible. Okay, the Bible, but also with some references not only to the New Testament but also to the Old Testament. We'll see, we'll understand better when we start seeing the images. In these texts, a lot of importance is given to Old Testament prophecies. Okay, they were called the testimonia. Okay, because the Old Testament was kind of a proof given before about the reality that was to happen. Okay, now if you remember in the last lecture we discussed the so-called dogmatic sarcophagus, and we already made many references. For example, when we were discussing the image of the Epiphany that was found in the sarcophagus, we made many references to the Old Testament. That is what we shall be doing today as well. Mary appeared in these texts as the proof of the true incarnation of the Son of God in the midst of several heresies that were kind of very popular in the first couple of centuries that denied the full humanity of Jesus. Okay, so Mary, first and foremost, her true, let's say, importance was to prove that she was a real biological mother, therefore that Christ had a true human nature. You remember what scene we saw in the dogmatic sarcophagus where Mary was visible? It was the scene of the Epiphany. And I had told you also that in the first centuries, Epiphany was the feast of the Incarnation. It was not Christmas, it was the Epiphany, when the Son of God, born from Mary, was kind of revealed to the nations, not only to the Jews, but also to the nations, to the Gentiles, as the true King, as the Son of God. Therefore, the presence of Mary there was there to prove Christ's true humanity. Okay, in fact, as we said, Mary is there simply to prove a Christological point. And this is what we shall see, as I am saying, in the first part of this lecture. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who lived, or rather who was eaten by lions around the year 120, therefore we are in the early 2nd century, writes the following. He tells us, in his letter to the Ephesians, our God, Jesus Christ, was carried in the womb of Mary, according to God's economy, therefore according to God's plan. He was made man by the seed of David and of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, here, Ignatius, he is, through the instruction that he is giving, he is also showing us indirectly that there were people who did not believe that Christ was truly born of Mary. Okay, so with these kind of texts, along with other similar texts coming from other fathers, the mystery, we can say, of the Virgin Mother is underlined. Okay, not simply the fact that Mary was a virgin, but the fact that she was a true mother. Okay, so when we read these texts coming from the 1st century or from the late 1st century or early 2nd century, we understand this, let's say, this preoccupation that the authors had, that there were people who did not believe that Christ was truly born from a normal woman, okay, in a normal way as humans are born. So these texts show the importance of the Christological role of Mary, as I am saying, in the minds of the early Christian communities. Texts hailing from the end of the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, that have moved forward practically a century, they still insist on the virginity of Mary, and they defend her biological intactness during the conception of Christ and also after his birth. So this was the second important thing about Mary. The first thing was to prove that she was truly a biological mother. Secondly, in order to prove that the son that she gave to the world was truly God, was to insist on her virginity, that she did not conceive through through intercourse with a man, okay, and therefore the seed that was kind of implanted in her, we can say, to use current biological and medical language, the seed that was implanted in her did not come from a man, but came from the spirit, obviously without having to make Mary lose her virginity. So this was the second important thing, and we also find some imagery related even to this. The most important and the most prominent of Christian texts of the 2nd century, where Mary's virginity is defended at all costs, is the so-called Protovangelium of James. Okay, this is the story and the apocryphal book about practically the birth of Mary, her betrothal to Joseph, all the way till the birth of Jesus and eventually the escape into the flight into Egypt. In this book, in the Protovangelium of James, which comes, as I said, from the mid-2nd century, we read the story of the midwife who was called Salome, whom Joseph brought to Mary in order to help her give birth. Okay, but when she arrived, Mary had already given birth. Salome did not want to believe that Mary was still a virgin, and therefore she checked her body. She tried to touch her. She tried to touch her intimate parts in order to see whether she was still a virgin, whether the hymen was still there, practically. And as soon as she touched Mary's hands, her hands fell off, okay, as a punishment for touching what was untouchable. And you see this picture comes from the Middle Ages. It does not come from the early Christian era, but it's just to show you how much the texts coming from this period that we are discussing also inspired art at a later stage. And in this case, we see Mary kneeling down in front of Christ, and obviously the crib is not seen because I zoomed in the most important part, and behind Mary we see that lady with no hands, okay, and the hands are held by an angel right behind her. Obviously the story goes, it has a happy ending, and Salome asks for forgiveness. Mary places the child Jesus next to her. Jesus touches her and her hands grow back. Okay, so practically the story is a happy one. Fine. But as we can see, it's kind of the important thing was to show in any way possible that Mary cannot be touched. Okay, therefore her body cannot be touched in any way, which would put into some kind of danger of defiling her. Now, a similar episode, which has also found its way into Christian iconography from the very first centuries, is related to Mary's death. Okay, so we have this story related to Christ's birth, where a couple of hands are literally chopped off because they try to touch Mary. Then we find something similar when Mary actually died. Okay, when Mary died, while the apostles were transporting her body on a stretcher to be buried, a Jew wanted to defile Mary. Okay, he wanted kind of to push her off the stretcher, kind of, as a way of showing his disrespect for having brought into the world this, the child, the man who eventually kind of ruined Judaism. And as soon as he touched the stretcher, an angel appeared and chopped off his hands. Okay, and you can see this in another icon. Okay, I have zoomed in the small part. As you can see, there is Mary dead and the apostles all around her. Then there is Jesus with a baby in his hands. The baby represents the soul of Mary. And underneath you can see that very small Jew trying to touch the stretcher and an angel right in front of him. And in the zoom picture, you'll see that the hands are literally cut off. Okay, the angel had just gave him kind of a good hitting that sword, and the hands obviously went off. Now, these texts coming from the 2nd and the 3rd century, this comes from the Transitus Maria, if I'm not mistaken, one of the books related to the Assumption of Mary, practically about the death of Mary. And the original kind of corpus comes from the 2nd, 3rd century. But then the form in which we have the book nowadays comes from the 6th century, but it has very clearly ancient sources. Now, These texts coming from this very early stage, 2nd and 3rd century, and which were later, as we said, popular in Christian art, especially in the medieval period, can be regarded as proof of the early Christians' belief that Mary's body remained intact throughout her life due to her intimate relationship with the Son of God. Okay, so all this points to the fact that when we see Mary presented in these early centuries, be it in art, be it in literature, etc., Mary is always presented in some way related to Christ. And it will help us understand why the first images of Mary were those which actually are, okay, as we shall be seeing. Now, the first part of this lecture today, that was only the introduction, discusses the most ancient images of Mary that we know of, which come from the catacomb of Priscilla. Okay, the catacomb of Priscilla is one of the largest and the most beautiful catacombs that there are in Rome. Okay, in Italian, the catacomb of Priscilla is known as La Regina delle Catacombe. Okay, because apart from being enormous, it is also the most beautiful. I mean, there are some chambers which are literally so painted that are much more beautiful than churches that we see nowadays. I mean, churches, imagine St. John's Cathedral. Imagine something like that, or even better, but on underground. I mean, so Priscilla's catacombs is truly a gem. If ever you go to Rome, make sure to visit Priscilla's catacomb. So let's start. The earliest known image of Mary, which we know of, is this fresco dating back from shortly before the year 250. Okay, so we are in the mid-3rd century. And it is found in one of the underground chambers in the catacomb of Priscilla in Rome, which was originally decorated with stucco. So this chamber was decorated with painting and with stucco. Nowadays, obviously, much of the painting and the stucco is unfortunately lost because of humidity, because of vandalism, etc. But thankfully, this image is still there. Okay, if you go, you can still see it. And if I'm not mistaken, it has been also conserved. There has been some restoration work on it, and it is slightly better than what you see in this picture. When I went there, however, it was still as you see it here. Okay, but nowadays it's slightly more detailed, more refined. Now, this image is found at an angle which does not align properly with the original decoration. So what does this mean? This means that before this painting was made, there was some other decoration, and it was practically a good shepherd. Okay, there was a shepherd made of stucco. Parts of it are still visible, which was at the center of a ceiling. Now, this picture is not kind of next to it, it's kind of at an angle. So the good shepherd is like this. And then this picture is like this, so it doesn't make any sense, but there is a reason, and we'll try to understand why. I will also show you a picture later on of the whole ceiling with the good shepherd and this image here, just to see what I mean. Anyway, so this would either have been made by mistake, or else it was done on purpose. Okay, most probably it was done on purpose. What do we see here? We see Mary seated with Christ in her arms, facing a male figure dressed with a tunic and a pallium, and whose left hand is pointing at Mary. His left hand is showing Mary. The left hand is this bit here. And his finger is pointing to something above Mary, which if you look closely, you can see that here there is a star. Okay, so you should already understand most probably who this figure is if you have already followed the lecture about the dogmatic sarcophagus. Now, we said that he is wearing a tunic and a pallium. Now, a tunic and a pallium were technically the robes that were dressed by philosophers. Okay, philosophers had this particular vestment in order for people to recognize that they were philosophers. Therefore, they could either be philosophers, teachers. Remember, the idea of philosopher was very, let's say, very widespread back then. So anyone dressed in this particular robe was understood to be an intelligent person who could be either a teacher, a philosopher, a prophet, whatever. Okay, so the robes of the male figure show, as we said, that he is an important person. Now, since we are in a biblical context, in the Bible we don't find philosophers, we find prophets. Okay, so that personage there, that figure, is a prophet. Therefore, the whole composition, okay, therefore the image of Mary with the child, the star, and the prophet does not refer to the birth of Jesus, but rather to an Old Testament prophecy, which was made by the prophet. And the prophecy in question is that Jesus is truly the Messiah. Remember that he is pointing to the star that was foretold in the Old Testament by a particular prophet who was not even a Jew, if you remember from last lecture. The prophecy in question, as I said, is that Jesus is truly the Messiah, the Son of God, born of the Virgin. Okay, he is the star which represents divine royalty. And this was prophesied, I think you remember by now, by Balaam in the book of Numbers. Okay, Balaam is the prophet who was not even a Jew, who was a Gentile, who foresaw this star which would rise when a particular son of Jacob, a descendant of Jacob, would be born. And this son of Jacob would be eventually the leader of the world. Okay, that was, in short, the prophecy. You can go and see the slides of the previous lecture, and you will have it written there, the prophecy of Balaam. Now, what is the focal point of this artistic composition, which, as you say, it is comprised of three parts: the prophet, Mary with baby Jesus, and the star above them. The what can we say? I mean, the focal point is the center of this whole image, and the center is the prophet's hands. Okay, both of them, which, as we said, one is showing Mary, and the other is pointing to the star. One hand, as we said, indicates the star, reminding us of Balaam. Okay, so had there been only that finger pointing at the star, the prophet would surely be Balaam. The other hand, however, is kind of presenting Mary to whoever is looking at the prophet. Okay, and this kind of reminds us of something else. Okay, there is a particular prophet who speaks of, let's not say Mary, but speaks of a virgin who would conceive and give a son. Okay, and that prophet is Isaiah. And the famous words, behold, the virgin will conceive and will bear a son, and he will be called God with us. Okay, so who is the prophet? Is it Balaam or is it Isaiah? Most probably it is neither. Okay, neither one nor the other. Here, the prophet most probably does not represent a particular prophet, a historical figure, you can say. He would represent most probably all the Old Testament prophecies related to Jesus, okay, related to the Messiah. The star, which represents his kingship, the hand pointing at Mary, which represents his true humanity. Remember that this was created by a Christian artist who wanted to pass on a message in a particular context, a context which at times denied Christ's divinity and at times denied Christ's humanity. So that figure there, the prophet, is most probably a personification, we can say, of Old Testament prophecy. Old Testament prophecy, which Christians believed had enough information showing that the Messiah would be divine and also human. Okay, so that is what this whole composition is all about. Now, we said that the image of Mary is not in line with the rest of the decoration. That was one of the first things I told you when I showed you this picture. As I said, it might have been done by mistake or it might have been done on purpose. Now, what is certain is that the hand pointing to the star, so this hand here, this finger, is also pointing to something found beyond the star, okay, which, as I said, is the figure of the Good Shepherd. And this is the whole ceiling, okay? As I told you, it had decorations probably made earlier of stucco. This is the figure of the Good Shepherd. As you can see, it's not a painting, it is stucco, okay? And there are also remnants of the sheep. Eventually, the trees were painted, and also the figure of Mary. You can see it here. Okay, you have Mary with the child and the prophet standing up. Okay, so as you can see, as I told you, one is like this and the other is like this. Okay, you wouldn't have an artist doing this kind of obscenity unless you really wanted him to do so. So if we take the finger, he's pointing at the star and eventually also pointing to the Good Shepherd. So probably the two images are linked. Okay, what is the link? The whole composition might mean that after the Virgin gives birth, her son will take care of the flock. Okay, the flock are obviously the people who are looking for God in their lives. Therefore, this is also found, this whole interpretation, you can say, is related to another prophecy from the Old Testament, which is found in the book of Ezekiel. And we find this: I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I will make them lie down, says the Lord. I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. So practically, what do we have here? There was an original image of the shepherd. Then there was, for some reason, the need to add the image of Mary, but it had to be linked to the shepherd. Okay, so we have the shepherd, Mary with the prophet, as we said, representing Isaiah and Balaam, or it's the whole of Old Testament prophecy, and linking the two images together, the baby, who is the star, who is also the shepherd, brought together with this quote from Ezekiel. So as you can see, most surely the people who commissioned these works of art knew their Bible very well. They also knew how to use images in order to link one thing with the other. If this is the case, so as we said, if this composition of two different images made in two different periods but linked together, if this is the case, the two images unite together these many Old Testament prophetic allusions regarding the Messiah. As we said, the Messiah who is born of a virgin, the Messiah who is the leader, the Messiah who is divine, the Messiah who is the shepherd. Okay, all these put together. Another possible inspiration for this painting is the Proto-Evangelium of James, which I have already mentioned. And as we said, it dates back to the 2nd century, which is roughly 100 years before the image of Mary was painted. In this text, in this book, this gospel, the author conveniently makes Joseph leave the scene when Mary is about to give birth. As I told you, Joseph went around looking for a midwife, okay, and he found Salome, who unfortunately did not believe that Mary was a virgin, and she got her hands chopped off. Anyway, so when Joseph comes back to the cave with the midwife, they stop and look, and Mary is already with the child in her hand, okay? And what the text really says is that as soon as they reached the cave where Mary was found, there was a very bright light and they couldn't see anything. When the light kind of abated, they could see Mary holding the baby in her hand. Okay, so if this was the inspiration of the picture, what are we seeing here? The star might be representing the bright light that was surrounding Mary and Jesus, obviously. And in this case, the other figure would be none other than Joseph. Scholars, however, are not inclined to accept this theory. One of the reasons is because when Joseph starts to be represented in the very first images of the Nativity, they were found actually in sarcophagi, but also in icons, Joseph is represented in a very particular way. Joseph is presented as a person kind of not understanding what is going on. Okay, he is either put somewhere in a corner, not even looking at Mary with the baby, or else he is put next to Mary but with his hands like this. Kind of, I have no role in all this, obviously because Joseph was not the father of Jesus. Now, in this image, the figure in front of Mary does not look really kind of uninvolved. Okay, he's kind of pointing at Mary and then the star. So most probably it is not Joseph. But if it is Joseph, this is the first image of Joseph that we have in Christian art, okay, coming from the 3rd century. But as we said, most probably it is not Joseph. Anyway, Mary is seen again in the catacomb of Priscilla in the so-called Greek chapel. Now, the Greek chapel is one of the most beautiful chapels that we have, underground chambers that we have in this catacomb. And this time it is once again in the scene of the Magi, okay, the Magi who are adoring Jesus and presenting their gifts. Now, this dates to sometime after the first image. Okay, so the first image is sometime before 250. This is dated to sometime after 250. It represents, as we said last time when we discussed the dogmatic sarcophagus, it represents the manifestation of the Son of Mary as the Messiah and the Lord of all, including the Gentiles. Obviously, the Gentiles represented by the Magi, okay, the Magi who were not Jews, who were pagans. This recalls a prophecy which is found in Psalm 72, and this is what we read. The kings of, it should be of, the kings of Tarsus and of the islands will bring him gifts. The kings of Arabia and of Saba will give him tribute. All will prostrate in front of him, and all nations will serve him. Okay, so here we have a prophecy that people who are not Jews will eventually go and prostrate in front of him. Since they are prostrating, they are adoring. Therefore, even though it is not all that clear here, the psalmist is speaking about the Messiah who will be divine. Okay, the Messiah who is God, because they are prostrating in front of him. Anyway, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Magi follow a star. Now, most certainly, early Christian writers must have been some kind of relation, might have seen some kind of relation between the star seen by the Magi and the star that Balaam prophesied, as we said last time. Okay, Balaam was the one who, in his prophecies, spoke of a star that will rise when this descendant of Jacob who would rule the world would be born. Okay, so here we see exactly kind of the connection. The early Christian writers must have certainly made a connection between the two texts. Now, this is the reason why it is in practically all the images of the Epiphany, Balaam is included behind the figure of Mary, and Balaam is most probably here. I mean, not most probably, he is there. Okay, he's not very clear. There are some pictures which are a bit more kind of sharp, but if you have good eyesight here, you'll see the head here and the figure standing here. Okay, it is not very clear, I know, but I mean, these are nearly 2,000 years old after all. So, and in fact, as we said, we are seeing him here as well. The image in the Greek chapel is mostly faded, but sure enough, a figure visible behind Mary is present, just as we have seen last time in the dogmatic sarcophagus. Now, a curious detail which seems to be quite unique to this Epiphany scene here is the composition of the three Magi. Now, if you remember, I have told you last time that the Magi are kind of recognized by the funny hats that they wear, okay? And you can see the funny hats here as well. They are like Smurfs. I don't know whether you remember the Smurfs, but they did have these strange hats, and the Magi are wearing that kind of hats here. However, in these figures, as you can see, there are no somatic details. Okay, you don't see any features. They are simply silhouettes. Silhouettes with different colors. You know, there were some very intelligent people who said, there you see the color of the Italian flag. Red, white, and green. Okay, but obviously a bit misplaced. In reality, that's not the important thing. Okay, not the fact that they are white, red, and green, but the fact that they are silhouettes with just one color. And if we look at the figure of Mary, there are some kind of details. I mean, you can see the color of the hair of Christ here. You can see the color of his body. You can see that her robes have some different colors as well. You can see her hair, which has a different color, or her veil, whatever. But these are simply shades. Why is that so? Most probably, as many art scholars believe, these colors refer to the plurality of the nations that were brought to the faith, whom are all represented by the Magi. Okay, so the different colors literally mean different nations, different people who, although from the outside might be different, they are actually all the same. In the eyes of God, everyone is the same. There is no difference between race, between orientation, nothing. Okay, so that's why they all have the same shape. The only thing that is different is their outside, their outward image. Okay, because one is red, one is green, and one is white. Okay, so this is, I think, yet another very deep thought that we find in art here. I mean, this artist already had this idea that in the eyes of God, everyone is the same, everyone is equal, regardless of how he looks, regardless where he is coming from, whatever. So, some Christian authors, like Origen, who wrote in the first part of the 3rd century, therefore sometime before these were being painted, Origen said that the Magi were in fact the descendants of Balaam. Okay, since they came from the east, just like Balaam came from the east. Okay, Origen had this this talent, we can say, of bringing together completely unrelated parts of the Bible and giving an interpretation that somehow made some sense. Okay, so he came up with this idea that Balaam was the one who prophesied the star. The Magi, who were his descendants, actually saw the star when it came. Okay, in later iconography, the image. Now, when I say later iconography, I am moving on kind of to the 5th, 6th century, not in the 3rd, 4th century where we are now. The image of the men standing behind Mary came to represent Joseph. Okay, and no longer the prophet. This seems to have been done deliberately, okay, because in many later cases like this one here, like this image here, the figure behind Mary, first of all, is not pointing at the star. So there is no relation whatsoever between the figure and the star. You can see the star here, but this figure here is not pointing at the star. Okay, he is simply standing behind Mary. And also to make sure that no one made a mistake, they wrote the name here. You see Joseph written here. But as we said, this comes much later, from the 6th century onwards. Okay, till the 6th century, the figure standing behind Mary is always Balaam. Okay. Now, other images of the Epiphany, which are found in the Roman catacombs, bring to light the unsolved problem of the exact number of the Magi who visited Jesus. Now, if I were to ask you how many were the Magi, you would most probably tell me 3. But Matthew, the evangelist who writes the story of the adoration of the Magi, does not give an exact number. Okay, he only says some wise men. You can go and check the text. It's Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Okay, some wise men. He does not say 3 wise men. So some wise men. Probably would tell, but we even know their names. They were called Casper, Melchior, and Balthazar. But these were in reality invented in the 5th century. These names are found for the first time in the so-called Armenian Gospel of the Infancy of Jesus, which, as I said, was written in the 5th century. So sometime even after many of these paintings or sculptures that we are seeing were actually made. Now, how did we come to the idea that there were only 3 Magi? The reason is due to the number of gifts. Okay, Matthew tells us that these wise men, some wise men, brought gifts of gold, incense, and myrrh. Okay, so we very conveniently said that there were 3. One was carrying the gold, one is carrying the myrrh, and one is carrying the incense. But as we said, this was a popular decision. It was never an official decision. Okay, there is no kind of documentation anywhere that says that the number of the Magi was 3. Now, in art, however, artists were more adventurous. They did not keep to the number 3. I mean, most of them kept to the number 3, but some were a bit more, adventurous, as we are saying, especially when they put Mary and Jesus in the center of the scene. So how can you have a balanced scene if you put Mary and Jesus in the center and you have to fit in 3 other persons? So what did they do? Sometimes they just put 2 Magi, and sometimes they put 4. Okay, so, but as we said, these are quite rare cases. But I mean, it's good to know that sometimes, I mean, they were also aware that St. Matthew does not give a precise number. Okay, so here we have Mary in the middle, and these two here. Here we have Mary in the middle, and 4 Magi here, 2 on each side. Unfortunately, I did not find a good color picture of this one. If I'm not mistaken, even this has been restored. Okay, this, as you can see, it has been restored quite lately. If you look for this picture, you write on some search engine on the internet, the Epiphany with 2 Magi, this image will come in, and there are many photos of how this image was before. Okay, it was much more blurred. And now, I'm not mistaken, even this one has been restored, but I did not manage to find any pictures. Now, the first one, the one with the 2 Magi, is found in the catacomb of Saint Peter and Marcellinus. Okay, and it comes from the late 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century, therefore around the year 300, you can say. The one with the 4 Magi is found in the catacomb of Domitilla, and it also comes from the late 3rd century, early 4th century. Now, the even numbers, 2 or 4, obviously are preferred in order to produce a more symmetrical artistic composition. Remember, sometimes art is put before, how can you say, common belief. Okay. Anyway, now the final important scene found in the catacomb of Priscilla, dating from the mid-3rd century, therefore round about the year 250, is considered to be a scene of the Annunciation. And this is the first one of its genre. And this is the picture. Okay? What do we see here? We can see a seated figure which looks female from the hair, and a standing figure which from the hair seems to be male. Now, this is painted on the vault of a cubiculum and very close to a lucernaria. Now, what is a lucernaria? Lucernaria is a hole which used to go all the way from the underground chamber to the surface. Okay, and it was important for light and also for air circulation. In a way, we can say that this scene also enters into the Christian community's interpretation of messianic prophecies found in the Bible. However, this time the prophecy is not found in the Old Testament. It is a prophecy which is found in the New Testament, the prophecy that the angel Gabriel gives to Mary. Okay, just before she conceived, he made a prophecy that she will conceive and she will eventually give birth to the Son of God, who will be a descendant of David, and also who will sit on his throne, and who will also be called, as we said, the Son of God. Now, worthy of mention is this context. Worthy of mention in this context is the fact that, once again, in close proximity to this Marian scene of the Annunciation, there is, once again, a painting of a good shepherd. So we can link, once again, together the two scenes. Okay, so there is the prophecy made by Gabriel and the actualization of the prophecy and all those that came before, all those of the Old Testament, in the figure of Jesus as the good shepherd. Okay, so remember what I have told you in one of the early lectures. In order to make sense of these scenes, we always have to see the whole context. We cannot judge from a scene on its own. We have to see what there is around it and try to form an interpretation of the whole compound. Okay, so these two would make sense if we see in the prophecy of Gabriel the actualization of Jesus shepherding the flock. This scene, therefore, the scene of the Annunciation, is probably intended as the fulfilling of the promises represented in the other scenes. Okay, so all the other scenes that were found in the related to the Old Testament are kind of actualized in the scene of the Annunciation of Mary. To our knowledge, the scene of the Annunciation is found only one other time in Christian art, and this is in the catacombs of St. Peter and Marcellinus, but unfortunately there are no pictures available of this scene. And this image also dates from the 3rd century. So 3rd century, there was already this kind of interest in Mary as the one who is bearing Christ, the one who is the fulfillment of the prophecies. Okay, so we'll stop here for the first part, and we'll meet in the next clip to discuss some, this time, sculptured images of Mary. Here we are kind of linked only to frescoes. Now we'll discuss some reliefs. Okay, so see you in the next part.